An elven warrior trapped on modern-day Earth. Two friends with different destinies meet at a magical school. These are some of the stories we at Electric Lips Comics are working on. You can get your copies of both The Mana Chronicles and Tales of Itherel at elpmerch.com. Support independent creators. Explore the merch featuring exciting ELP Comics art with a wide range of designs. Electric Lips Comics. Imagination electrified.
Welcome everyone to another Conversations the Void. You'll notice a new video for us. Yes, we have a sponsor, ELP Comics, and I'm wearing one of their Hawaiian shirts right now. I can't say enough great things about it. I absolutely love it. It is black, which is my favorite color. So, anyway, welcome to the show tonight. I'm excited for our guest tonight. So, I have a little short thing you might recognize. You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop. Conversations in the Void. We have writer, producer with works, including Bleacher Bums, Rebel Highway, and of course, the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. Please welcome to the Void, the one and only Steve and J. Rubin.
Happy Halloween! Almost.
Almost. Yeah, we love Halloween. We talk all things horror here and everything. So, but you are out of the contiguous United States for Halloween.
I am. I'm actually talking to everybody from the island of Maui in Hawaii. It's a treat. My wife and kids are here. We're doing a little vacation before craziness. So we're just got here, so I'm just suffering from a little bit of over fun. Yeah, I can imagine. Airports are just a load of fun. Yeah, that wasn't the worst part. Actually, flying over from LA, I watched Twister, which was actually pretty good. Glenn Powell seems to be literally in every movie now, and it was and the girl, Daisy Jones, she's pretty cool too. I recommend it. You know, I saw the original Twister with Bill Paxton, which was fun. This was pretty harrowing. It was good.
Yeah. My wife loves the original Twister. She watched the new one. She goes, Helen Hunt could have been in it. Why she wasn't, I don't know.
It's funny because I had a choice of also watching Deadpool and Wolverine, but I know that my wife wanted to watch that with me, so I picked Twister, and then I looked at the other seat thing, and she's watching Deadpool and Wolverine. Go figure.
Also fantastic movie.
Yeah, no, I'm hearing great things about it. I look forward to seeing it.
All right, so Steven, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the show, we have to get to know you a little bit better. So, off camera, we'll talk about a little bit of your writing. So how did you get into the world of writing as a whole?
UCLA Daily Bruin. I was a student at UCLA studying history in the days when you could actually not worry about the future. And I stumbled into the Bruin. I ended up being a staff writer for 2 years. Very interesting period in time. It was during Watergate. So our little AP machine would ding, 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 ding every time somebody was being fired or there was controversy. Kind of fun being in this newsroom, kind of like a pint-sized Woodward and Bernstein situation. But more importantly, I saw my articles being read by people, and it got me thinking, wow, people actually read my stuff. And simultaneously, I had become involved with a magazine published in Chicago called Cine Fantastique, which was at that time the only film journal in the world that really got seriously into sci-fi, horror, and fantasy films. I mean, there's a bookstore in Los Angeles called Larry Edmunds. It's kind of like the movie bookstore, kind of a meeting ground for anybody who's interested in movies. And I used to go up there in high school, and I saw cover the films of George Pal, and I kind of knew who George Pal was from The Time Machine and War of the Worlds. Right. So I picked up that magazine, and then I got in touch with the editor because I had interviewed the first book I ever wrote had nothing to do with sci-fi, fantasy, horror. It was called Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 to 1970. And one of the guys I interviewed was a screenwriter named Ted Scherderman, who wrote a movie called Hell to Eternity, which was one of the first World War II movies to show Japanese as human beings.
Right.
And it was the story of this guy, Guy Gabaldon, played by Jeffrey Hunter, who later played in the pilot. He was Captain Pike in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And many people remember him from The Searchers and a million other movies. But during the course of this interview, Ted told me that a certain scene reminded him of what he did on the movie Them. Now, Them is kind of a signature movie for me that I remember seeing as a kid, the giant ants, the New Mexico desert, that kind of thing. So I wrote to Fred Clark, and I said, who's the editor of Cinefantastique, I said, would you be interested in an interview with the writer who wrote Them? And he was very enthusiastic. He encouraged me to reach out to the director, Gordon Douglas. And I did both interviews. But the big thing that happened was I went to Warner Brothers, and the still department people let me look in the key book of behind the scenes stills.
Oh.
And I was able to license, well, they just probably gave them to me since we were a magazine. I got 3 behind the scenes stills into the magazine article, and people went nuts when they saw that. They'd never seen behind the scenes on Them. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal these days because there's all this stuff on the internet, but back in the 70s, it was kind of a coup. So I kind of started working in what I call film archaeology, where I would base my research on actual interviews with the people who made the movies. And it got me started doing that. And then shortly after that, I decided that I would write a behind-the-scenes history of the James Bond movies. Mm-hmm. And no one had ever done anything like that. So I got a lot of kudos for that, and it kind of started me on my writing career.
Yeah, and, I like to usually ask what people's favorite horror movie is. So, Steve, with all your work that you've done, you watch a lot of movies. What is your favorite horror movie?
Probably the movie that still gives me chills today. It's the original Haunting, directed by Robert Wise from 1963. A movie that, interestingly, has literally 0 visual horror. But it still scares the bejesus out of me because there's scenes in the movie using sound. And Robert Wise, the award-winning director of West Side Story and The Sound of Music, who kind of cut his teeth working for Val Lewton back in the 40s. He also edited a little film called Citizen Kane. So Robert Wise knew his chops or had his chops. And so The Haunting still is a movie that chills. And I also think the original Poltergeist, Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, still has some really, I judge the effectiveness of a horror movie that I always watch them with a light on.
That's a fair thing. My wife, she loves horror movies, but if there's something involved in the mirror, she goes, nope. Like, we barely have mirrors in our house because she's afraid of stuff like in Poltergeist 3, the mirrored hallway and stuff like that, because we grew up with that, and she just still scares her to this day.
Well, I grew up as a real fraidy cat. We go down to the Saturday double feature, and if it was a horror movie, literally, you'd find me sitting in the lobby waiting for a sci-fi title because I could handle science fiction. But the horror stuff, I was a sheltered only kid, so I saw monsters in every window.
Right. So, I have to show this, because we're going to be talking about this. I have on Laserdisc Twilight Zone's Volume 2. And like I said, I love Twilight Zone, and obviously you did too. So you grew up watching that show, right?
You would think that, but it freaked me out. I remember I was 8 years old. I went into the living room. My parents had an episode on called The Silence. And The Silence takes place in a private club where this old retired army officer is really upset with this guy who can't stop talking. He's like an insurance salesman. So he finally bets the guy, I think he bets some $500,000 that he can't shut up for a whole year. And they put the guy in a glass apartment in the basement of the private club, and he's monitored 24/7. Well, after 5 minutes of watching that, it just freaked me out. Telling an 8-year-old you can't talk for a year, it's just freak zone. So I never watched the Zone after that until much later when they were in reruns. And of course, I came to really love the series. I would argue today that the Twilight Zone just from start to finish was one of the the best scripted series ever. You know, it's an anthology. Obviously, you're getting a new episode every week. But between the casts and Rod Serling's writing, he wrote 92 of the 156. So you got one of the greatest writers of the 20th century writing a fantasy sci-fi horror series. You don't get much better than that.
Yeah, and I've always argued too that Twilight Zone gives us the tropes of sci-fi and horror that exist today that we still follow. You know, my producer's favorite episode concept is, you know, 5 people in search of an exit. We have a group of people in a room. They don't know anything about themselves or each other. And they're trying to figure out what's going on. You know, we have the classic monster stuff. We have the suspense. We have apocalyptic things. And it's just an innovation and pioneer of TV show that is even seen in, say, the X-Files 30 years later, and Fringe and all that stuff.
Oh, Black Mirror. I think every filmmaker who works in genre today probably would say that the Zone influenced them. I think that what Rod Serling did was put no limits on your imagination. And to tell a writer that you could just write whatever you want, because, you know, and that's kind of what CBS gave the deal to Rod. I mean, Rod had been, you know, he had gotten his start in radio, and then he moved over to live television in New York, but they wouldn't let him do anything controversial. And it got him so frustrated because he was writing about the morality, the immorality, the life condition of humans. Right. And he couldn't be honest because TV was about selling toilet paper and deodorant. So, you know, you know, as he talks about it, I mean, to get a Holocaust drama on, you know, the sponsors would have revolted because they can't do a Holocaust story and then sell toilet paper 5 minutes later. Right. So he was very frustrated, and fortunately, he sold a pilot to Desilu, Desi Arnaz's and Lucille Ball's company, called The Time Element. It was just a 1-hour standalone starring William Bendix as this New York City bartender who goes to bed every night and dreams he's at Pearl Harbor the night before the attack. And he can't convince anybody that there's going to be this horrific thing in the next day. And he would wake up, and it was very popular. I mean, the letters that came in for this 1-hour show were off the charts, and that encouraged Rod to go in and pitch The Twilight Zone as a series. And CBS, you know, at that time he had won 3 Emmys for writing, so he was a very honored writer. And CBS gave them a deal they didn't give any writer, which was total control. He could write about anything, and nobody was sitting on him. Now, unfortunately, at the same time that Rod got this deal, the new head of programming was appointed, a guy named James Aubrey, who did not believe in anthology. He said people in television in the late 50s and early 60s, they wanted to watch Matt Dillon and Gunsmoke. They wanted to watch Elliot Ness on The Untouchables, Lucy, obviously. They wanted to stick with the same characters each week, not revisit a whole new story. So he didn't like Rod's show and was always trying to cancel it.
Yeah, that's amazing. The reruns in the 80s, because, you know, we had the revival in the 80s. I grew up watching the show with my dad, you know, and just like when it came on DVD, I go, all right, you're getting the complete collection. So, I mean, between your behind the scenes love you had with working with the magazine, and then your revival and love of, you know, Twilight Zone, how did you get into the writing the encyclopedia about Twilight Zone?
Well, I had a good success with my James Bond movie encyclopedia. I did that first in 1990 for another Chicago publishing firm, Contemporary Books. Did an update in 1995 and 2003. And then recently I sold a 4th edition to another Chicago publisher, Chicago Review Press. So there was some precedent in the encyclopedia way of sharing my love of a pop cultural icon. And I think writing encyclopedia is a lot of fun because you're fact collecting all over the wilderness. You're sitting there literally with a legal pad as you watch 156 episodes, and you're making note of everything that would deserve an entry. And I had a lot of fun just collecting information, but more importantly, I developed a good relationship with Rod Serling's widow, Carol. So she supplied me with a lot of photographs, and then she opened her files and I saw the original contracts for the actors, writers, and directors.
Oh, wow.
So that way I could tell you that this actor made $2,000 in this famous lead. I mean, these numbers are so tiny, but it just gave me kind of an inside track. And then I tracked down every living person who was still involved with the Twilight Zone. And I got some wonderful interviews with people. And, you know, I've been following the history for a while. There was a book published in '82 called The Twilight Zone Companion by Mark Scott Zicree. And Mark is kind of like the leading authority on the zone. But what I found needed to be really brought out were the actors who were in the zone. And so I wrote, I think, over 400 biographies of actors who were in the zone. And it's a who's who of all the great character actors of the 50s into the 60s. And some actors who were relatively new that no one knew who they were. I mean, you had Robert Redford, Charles Bronson, Cliff Robertson. These were all relatively new actors who had done a lot of TV work and live, but this was their, you know, this was one of their first major things in film television. And it's a great cast. I mean, people like Burgess Meredith, Jack Klugman, these are people that don't get their just due because they're not leading actors like, you know, like Sean Connery and Steve McQueen, but they were the main reason that these wonderful episodes clicked so well, because just really great acting. And Rod Serling, he didn't write all the episodes, as I mentioned, but Rod had a way of just getting inside people's head as human beings, just the dialogue-heavy shows.
Right.
And that kind of writing isn't around anymore. You know, now it's more about the effects and the action, the adventure, the travelogue. But, and that, by the way, I respect the revivals, but to me, the Twilight Zone has to be in black and white. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree. Like I said, the revivals are interesting. You know, like I said, we had the '80s. We had Jordan Peele do one a couple years ago. But I mean, you really took the encyclopedia work to heart. I mean, to go and talk to every person you're able to find. You just weren't just watching it and writing it down. You did the footwork, man, to get to all these interviews and bios.
And it was fun because I was talking to a lot of people who hadn't really been talked to before. I mean, and little facts that came out. For instance, Cliff Robertson, who was in 2 great episodes. He's in one about a ventriloquist dummy. That was one of the great episodes. And then he's also in an episode, I think it's called 30 Yards Over the, I can't remember the title now because there's so many titles, but it's about a wagon train driver from 1850 whose son got sick and he's looking for water and he crosses over a ridge and there's a 20th century truck stop and a diner. It's a very cool episode. But Cliff was an interesting man. He was one of the first private pilots in America. His godfather was Orville Wright.
Wow.
So this is a guy steeped in a lot of aviation history. And in fact, actually, no, I'm sorry. I mixed it up. It's Bob Cummings' father, who godfather was Orville Wright. Bob Cummings, I believe, is in the first episode of season 2. And it's about a B-25 pilot, a medium bomber pilot whose plane has crashed in the North African desert, and he's having trouble finding his crew. Now, Bob Cummings was a well-known comic actor from a lot of his TV sitcoms, like The Bob Cummings Show. But I should say Cliff Robertson was also a pilot. He was one. Yeah. He was definitely a pilot. But Bob Cummings definitely was Orville Wright's godson. Anyway, these little facts about where these people came from. Some of them were a little darker in terms of reality. Gig Young, one of the great actors, had just been nominated for an Oscar for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And he was in one of the great episodes called Walking Distance, about a burnt-out advertising executive who fills up his car near his old hometown and then walks to the hometown, and all of a sudden it's not 1960 anymore, it's 1935, and he sees the old, the carousel in the small town. It's like has a kind of a Currier and Ives feeling about it. It's just old-time town. And Rod Serling had a great deal of nostalgia for the old days.
Right.
And but anyway, Gig Young got married and eventually killed his wife and took his own life. A horrible story. He was obviously in some kind of mental health torture, and that was sad. And there are a few stories like that. The actor who played the robot baseball pitcher in one of the great episodes, it's something about I think it's called The Mighty Casey. It's about a scientist who invents a robot pitcher and sells it to a minor league team that never does anything. And I think his name was Robert Sorens, I believe. He walked into a Ventura County nightclub in LA and shot somebody and went to prison.
Man, I mean,
so there's a little dark side to some of these Twilight Zone episodes, but
right.
A lot of fun people involved, and I've met them over the years. In fact, here's something funny. I went to my wife's college reunion at Stanford last weekend, and I'm sitting at one of these banquets. I'm sitting next to a lady, and her mother was in a Twilight Zone episode.
What? That's crazy.
I'm talking to her. Her mother's name was Patricia Berry, and she'd been in a lot of television. And she was in, I believe, an episode called The Closer. She played kind of a vamp, a lady who's driving the main lead nuts.
Right.
There's all sorts of Twilight Zone stuff going on in my life. I mean, I went to a symposium in Binghamton, New York, where Rod grew up. Mm-hmm. And a fellow author and I went over to his house where he spent the first few years of his life. And a lady came out of the house and offered to take a picture of us in front of the house, which I thought was great. And so we walked away. I look at the picture. It's in black and white. Excuse me? You take I had a typical iPhone. All the pictures are always color. This one was in black and white.
Wow. That's great. And, I know you also are a podcaster and you talk, your Saturday night at the movies, right? And you kind of take your work and you discuss the behind the scenes. It's almost you're doing a commentary with people involved with the movies you're watching too. So, I mean, what's that been like? Like, one that really stuck out to me is David Zucker in Airplane.
Being a podcaster is kind of reminding me of being back at Cinefantastic Steak in the 70s. I'm getting out there and interviewing people about interesting stories about the shows they do. And it just got me really enthusiastic about the business again. Because while I'm doing all this stuff, I'm also out there trying to sell screenplays and TV series pilots. And it's very difficult right now. I could use one of those Rod Serling tropes, where you find the coin that gives you instant powers, or find a genie. I could use a genie right now.
Well, I mean, I think we share the same passion of behind the scenes stuff. And that's why I do this show, is because I like to learn behind the scenes stuff that people don't generally know about. I've had production designers, I have art designers on the show because their stories, people see it, they don't know who they are. Yeah,
I mean, it's like that old story with the Naked City. There's a million stories in the Naked City. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a million stories on a naked film set. It's like there's all sorts. And I've worked on film sets. When I soon realized early on that I couldn't make a living as a writer, a real living. I make some money here and there.
Right.
I ended up becoming a publicist, and they loved my enthusiasm for the business, being a movie geek, and I would work on sets as a unit publicist, which is actually a crew job, and I got to be part of the filmmaking process. I got to work with my photographer. We took the stills and then got to know the actors. Sadly, I noticed the other day that we lost Terry Garr, who's a marvelous actress, and I got a chance to work with her in 1990.
Oh, wow.
34 years ago on a HBO Warner Brothers title called Mom and Dad Save the World. She and Jeffrey Jones play a typical couple who are abducted by John Lovett's Emperor Spengo in another galaxy. It was like working on The Wizard of Oz with that kind of mentality. A lot of costume characters, and Terry, you know, they dress her in this gown, and we're working in Santa Clarita, California, north of LA, on a soundstage with no air conditioning in the summer. So it was about 110 degrees on that set, and Terry's wearing this clingy, heavy gown, and boy, I'll tell you, she wasn't happy.
I can imagine. Yeah, I work in small independent horror films, and you know, doing behind the scenes stuff, assistant directing, helping write, and some acting. And it was just surreal the first time I did it, like a year and a half ago. You know, I'm sitting there going, all right, we're in a thunderstorm. We're shooting a chase scene of someone about to get murdered on a pot farm. And it's 3 a.m. Coyotes are howling, and there's cannon fire going off. And I'm just going, this is interesting. You know, this is.
And was this for a podcast or for a little indie movie? For
indie movie.
Oh, wow.
So that was my first experience with the team that I'm now part of, the Horror Dads, and it's absolutely amazing. I've been running full force with it since, and it's a blast to see everything behind the scenes and getting to see the final product to help make something for people to view. One of
my best friends in Los Angeles is a horror filmmaker. You may have heard of his name, William Malone, Bill Malone. Bill directed the remake of House on Haunted Hill for Joel Silver back in the late 90s. He did episodes of Tales from the Crypt and Masters of Horror. He did a horror film called Parasomnia. Bill is such a consummate horror filmmaker. We're trying to get one of his projects launched right now. In fact, it's over at the company that makes those Terrifier movies, which have caught on. Oh my God, Terrifier has become a big deal, hasn't it?
It has. We have my producer and co-host and I. We have mixed feelings about the trilogy so far, but it's amazing. Like I said, the industry is a wonderful place. As long, I think it's really easy to work with people. Just be nice. Just treat people like people, and that's all you really got to do.
Well, Bill became a friend because when I was working for Cinefantastique, I wanted to do a retrospective on a movie called Forbidden Planet from 1956. And of course, the real star of Forbidden Planet is Robbie the Robot, that kind of steampunk robot that was just so interesting. And I go over to Bill's house in Studio City. I walk into his den, and there's Robbie the Robot, the original Robbie the Robot. He bought it from a defunct museum in Anaheim, paid very little money for it. And I kind of think of Robbie as my uncle.
Yeah.
Morbius, something is approaching from the Southwest. That wonderful Marvin Miller voice. And if you haven't seen Forbidden Planet, it's one of the iconic science fiction films of all time. It kind of presages Star Trek, but it's just a wonderful film, and Robbie, of course, is key.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you get Turner Classic Movies and you have a Roku, they have what it's called TCM Watch. You know how Turner Classic Movies on demand has about 20 movies you can pop on at any time. But if you go on Roku to TCM Watch, there's like 200 movies. And one of the movies they have right now on the watch list is The Invisible Boy which is another Robbie the Robot story. Nothing to do with the Forbidden Planet, but it's there for free if you have a Roku.
Yeah, I love all the 50s, 60s sci-fi. Anything I can time, you go to like Target or something, you get like 100 movies on like 5 CDs or whatever for $20. And I always pick all of those up any chance I get, just because I try to collect as many of them as I can, just because I'm infatuated with the classic black and white stuff too.
So when somebody asks you what is your favorite horror movie of all time, what do you say?
Oh, mine's Evil Dead.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, everyone who knows me, I'm tattooed, and I have horror slashers from the 80s on my forearm, and then the upper part of my arm is all Evil Dead tattoos.
Ah.
So, I think they're great. Like I said, I love when we do the show and we do movie reviews weekly as well. And so we watch 3 to 4 horror movies a week and review them.
Okay, well, I'm not surprised. I mean, horror, I would say that probably for good reason, horror is bigger than ever in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that, and of course we're in Halloween season where there's a horror movie every weekend. Yeah. Just great. Actually, I just wrote one. We're hopeful, Billy Reback, my writing partner, and I are hopeful that we can get it out there and sell it someday soon. But we set it on a cruise ship. We haven't seen a lot of horror movies on cruise ships, so hopefully this could be fun.
I'm excited. Yeah, our latest movie from Horror Dads that we did, that I was a big part of, just released a couple of weeks ago. And then we are in pre-production of our next movie as well. So
excellent. Are you going to act in it?
I am going to act in it, but I plan on, my goal, I know Sean Bean has me beat. I want to get killed in every movie I'm in. Like viciously destroyed. And I tell people, I'm like, I did something for another movie I was in, and I sat in the makeup chair for an hour and a half. My first time doing that. And it was a blast. I was in makeup for that.
And what were you playing in makeup?
It was a head wound from where I got shot.
Oh, okay.
So, but I was also co-writer and assistant directing, and I was laying on the ground in a cornfield while other people were acting, and between takes, I was still not moving. I had the script in my hand, directing from the ground.
Corpse as director.
Yeah.
What a concept.
So it's something I always like to do. So Steve, what has been the wildest story you've ever heard from all your research and behind the scenes stuff in your interviews you've done?
I've heard some pretty wild ones. I think one of the more interesting ones, since I'm into the James Bond movies, and I do commentaries. I was asked to do the commentary track for Never Say Never Again, which was the remake of Thunderball that Sean Connery made in '83. Mm-hmm. And I was interviewing a writer named Lorenzo Semple Jr., who is well known in thriller ranks. I think he wrote 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford. He also wrote the Batman television series with Adam West. He told me that back in the 1950s, he got friendly with a producer actor who was the first one to acquire the rights to a James Bond title. It was Casino Royale. The name of the actor producer was Gregory Ratoff.
Okay.
I guess Gregory was in a airport lounge and he saw the paperback Casino Royale, which is the first James Bond novel that Ian Fleming wrote. So he told me, and I still laugh, he told me that they were developing the character for a woman. Susan Hayward was under contract to 20th Century Fox, and Lorenzo told me that they were actually going to turn her into a female James Bond, Jane Bond or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's funny because when the last James Bond movie came out, No Time to Die, there was a lot of talk that Bond was going to be replaced by a woman.
Right.
In fact, in the story, if you've seen the movie, and I won't give any spoilers, but James Bond is retired and the 007 number has been given to a female agent. It's not like she's becoming the new James Bond. It just happened they gave her
Right.
the designation.
Right.
So it's ironic that in reality, the first story that they ever tried to develop, they developed for a woman, which was Casino Royale back in the 50s. Well, obviously that didn't take, and it's probably a good reason.
Yeah. Oh man. So I also want, I know you're working on, I want to talk to you about the Mushi cat. Am I saying the name right?
Mushi.
And so you wrote that book, right? The Cat of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
And now you're working on animation for it.
Right.
Without spoiling anything, what's that process been like for you?
Oh, it's a long process. We've been working on this project for many years. We originally came up with an idea back in the 90s, and we thought it would make a good children's book, but we didn't know anything about writing children's book. We didn't know there was a formula and a way to do them. So we ended up moving over to start writing an animated feature, and it was inspired by me watching the original movie, The Diary of Anne Frank, that George Stevens produced in 1959. And there's a scene in that movie where just before the workers come to work, where everybody has to be quiet for 12 hours, they were chasing the cat around the attic. And the cat had been brought into the attic by Peter Van Pels, who was he was a member of the family that shared the place with the Franks.
Yeah.
And it suddenly dawned on me, what did the cat think of this strange situation where people literally never go outside and they have to maintain total stillness for 12 hours a day? So I called my friend David Miller, and David knows a lot about children's works. And I said, what do you think of a book called The Cat Who Lived with Anne Frank? And it started us on this journey. And the book was actually published about 4 years ago. Penguin put it out. It's a children's picture book. It's designed for kids 8 to 14. And now we've developed, and that's essentially Anne's story, but from the cat's point of view. We try to get into the head of Mushi. And see, Mushi's the only person, or I should say the only creature who can leave the attic every day. Mushi crawls through the window above the attic, their storeroom, and goes out onto the chestnut tree and then crawls around, around the city, which has become somewhat of a war zone. I mean, Amsterdam in 1942, they had checkpoints and guards and people in Nazi uniforms. So, but the movie is going to be Mushi's story. Mushi, we're going to follow him as he, in our kind of animal world, he joins the Dutch animal resistance against the Nazis. And our bad guys are the German Shepherds, Rottweilers, and Dobermans that patrol the canals.
Okay.
So it's kind of we kind of euphemistically call it the Lion King meets Inglourious Basterds.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, no, it's funny. In May, I went to Amsterdam on part of a family trip, and the bookstore, the guy who runs the bookstore took me on a tour of the backyard. Nobody goes to the backyard. It's off limits. He took me out in the backyards where the chestnut tree used to stand. It died, unfortunately, but they saved saplings, which are growing all over the world. But I got to see the backyard, which is kind of a thrill for me.
Yeah. So we're at the time, so let's get some wrap-up questions here. So Steve, we always ask practical or CGI as a movie buff. What do you think?
That's a really good question. I grew up on Ray Harryhausen Sinbad movies, Jason and the Argonauts, that kind of thing. Stop motion animation is one of my favorite, effects. I also remember a movie when I saw it as a kid called The Magic Sword. It's from 1962 with Basil Rathbone and Gary Lockwood. Great practical effects. It was done by a director, and I'm trying to remember his name real quickly. He did all of those movies like The Incredible or The Amazing Colossal Man, Attack of the Puppet People. All these 50s science fiction movies that were all about practical effects and forced perspective. And Burt I. Gordon was a specialist in doing things in the camera. But then, on the other hand, and then on the other hand, though, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. And watching the Lord of the Rings movies with their use of digital effects I mean, Peter Jackson is a master at it. And that trilogy for me is my favorite trilogy of all time. And I respect digital effects. My problem sometimes is they put more effort into the digital effects and not enough effort into the story.
Mm-hmm.
So you get kind of empty-headed movies. Now, I'm not saying they're all like that, but sometimes it just seems like they could have put some more effort into the story. Something a little more original.
Right. And you know, with the show that I do, working in indie horror, we always say that if you have a great story, we can forgive bad effects. You know, if you don't have the budget to make it look good. If the story's great and the characters are great, you're invested into the story no matter what.
You know, one of my favorite movies isn't very well known, but it was produced by Saul Bass, who was known for his very interesting title designs. Oh, in the 60s, he was Mr. Titles. And now I'm thinking of the name of the movie. Oh God, let me think for a second. Yes, Phase 4. Have you ever heard of a movie called Phase 4?
Phase 4. That comes up when I search for horror laser discs. I definitely have heard of it.
It's it's about some scientists who are studying unusual ant hills in the desert. You know, I'm obsessed with ants again. Here I am. And what's amazing is they used a lot of the same kind of microphotography that had been part of a very big documentary film called the Hellstrom Chronicle.
Okay.
And the Hellstrom Chronicle had all this amazing footage of insects. And what's amazing to this day, that, you know, talk about practical effects. There's a scene where a scout ant, a real ant, by the way, I'm not talking about a fake ant. This is a real ant shot with microphotography, is chewing on an air conditioning wire. And, you know, the ants are trying to assault this scientific conclave by knocking out their air conditioning. So these are smart ants.
Uh-huh.
So the ant's chewing on the wire. You see it full frame. And then the camera tilts up, and above him is a praying mantis. A praying mantis, obviously sent as kind of a anti-ant protector. So in a big swoop, the praying mantis grabs the ant off the air condition wire and starts chewing on it. But then the praying mantis starts wobbling, and the camera turns, and there's another ant pulling on the praying mantis's leg. Now, how they shot this, I have no idea. But he does that. He flips the praying mantis over onto the live wire and shorts out the whole air conditioner.
Wow.
And this isn't practical. I mean, these are real insects. There aren't any stunt insects. These are the real deals. How they got this praying mantis. Anyway, you brought up practical effects, and that to me is just a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and we did a whole episode about stop motion earlier this year, and there's this new horror movie called Stop Motion. It's about a stop motion animator and their work getting to their into her head.
I'm sorry, it's about what?
A stop motion animator, and her work starts eating away at her. She starts dreaming about it, and so she starts to go a little delusional with her stop motion.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So it's interesting. You should check it out if you haven't seen it.
Well, it's funny. Getting back to Peter Jackson, Peter Jackson does the King Kong remake, and the King Kong remake is too long. It just goes on forever. There's way too much going on before they even get to Skull Island. But I would argue that when Kong battles those 3 T-Rexes in that little crevice of, where they're kind of, I guess they're caught in the webbing or whatever, maybe the greatest special effects sequence I've ever seen, and just in terms of pure creativity. And then, of course, the guys end up in that grotto where they're attacked by all these insects, and ooh boy, I still have children watching that kind of stuff. But I mean, the digital effects toolbox is literally like a magic lamp right now. You can create literally anything. And like I said, I think just as long as they marry it to some original story making, I think it'll be cool.
Yeah. All right. So, Steve, if you could write your next, without spoiling anything, if you're writing another encyclopedia, is there another fandom that you would want to write the next encyclopedia for?
You know, it's a really good question. I've been asked that before, and I don't think so. I think that I'm focusing. Actually, I'm writing a novel. I am writing a novel. It's going to be a horror novel. Oh. So I think it might be if I can get this thing moving in the right direction, maybe I could get on the show someday and talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just got through reading Jaws for the first time. I had never read the original book. And although this novel I'm writing has nothing to do with the sea, I was curious how Peter Benchley dealt with the characters, because you got to have great characters in a novel. So I was inspired by that. And then with my screenplays, I'm focusing right now on comedy. I really feel that comedy is an arena that has not been very good lately, and I think there's opportunities.
Awesome. So, Steve, do you have any advice for anyone getting into what you do, whether it's screenwriting, whether it's writing books, anything, tidbits you can give them?
Well, I think that pick a subject you're passionate about, because if you really want to do something, if you can get up the gumption to do the research and interview people, find original material. Don't just rely on what you find on Google. Try to find the people who created the stories you want to do and interview them. That's how I kind of made my bones, by getting to the original people. I was one of the last people to interview Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh, wow.
That was a great thrill for me. And it was kind of funny. It was back in my Cinefantastic days. My friend Kyle Counts was writing a retrospective article on the birds. Mm-hmm. And he literally calls me up on a Friday. He says, Steve, I can't get down there. Will you interview Hitchcock on Monday? I said, let me think about it. The most no-brainer question anybody's ever asked me in life. And I spent an hour with the master. It was just amazing. In fact, if you go on my podcast, Stephen J. Rubin, Saturday Night at the Movies, my interview with Hitchcock is now on the podcast. It's if you're listening, don't mind the first 2 minutes. I was conducting the interview with one of those little cassette recorders. So the first 2 minutes are kind of wonky. But once you get into the interview, he's there. It's not that famous voice,
That's awesome. All right. So you ready for your random horror trivia question?
Oh, okay.
All right.
Is this the question you're going to ask me?
Yeah. It's from a card. So, all right. John Waters wrote and directed this 1994 dark comedy starring Kathleen Turner as a passionate mother.
As a passionate what?
Mother. She's
a passionate mother.
Yes.
Oh, God. Did you say Kathleen Turner?
Yes. And John Waters, yeah.
John Waters. I think you got me.
All right, you want to know?
I do.
Serial Mom.
Serial Mom, okay.
Yeah. I just rewatched that movie a couple of weeks ago with my wife. She's like, I don't know the last time I saw this. I mean, it's been a while, but it's a classic John Waters comedy, but it's dark, so
okay.
it's
By the way, one of my podcast guests was Jo Beth Williams, who co-stars in the original Poltergeist.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite scenes, which still sends chills up my back, is when they're in the kitchen and her little daughter is watching the TV, and she notices that the chairs at the kitchen table are spread out a little bit. So she puts the mother, Jo Beth's character, Diane, puts them back together, and then she walks back into the sink and then walks back out, and they're all stacked on top of each other. Talk about a scene that sends chills up your back. In reality, Jo Beth told me, and I hate to spoil this for people, but whatever, like 8 grips had to bring all those chairs that had already been glued together across this, making enough noise to wake the dead, across the kitchen floor, set them up, and then get out of the way. it kind of just put filmmaking in perspective. But Poltergeist still has some really creepy stuff in it and some signature scenes that still work for me. And like I said, I always watch it with a light on.
There you go. All right, so Steve, so before we go, where can people find you and follow you and learn about your upcoming works?
Okay, so I have two podcasts. Stephen J. Rubin Saturday Night at the Movies is on all the platforms. That's JAY. And we also have a YouTube channel now. And then I do another podcast with my friends Julian Schlossberg and Arthur Friedman. We produce a show called Tales from Hollywoodland, and that's also available on the podcast platforms. My website is stephenjrubin.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I think my Instagram is under my company name, Fast Carrier Pictures.
Okay.
And then in terms of my work, I mean, we're working comedy. I mean, one of the projects we're trying to sell right now is a spoof of the great courtroom drama 12 Angry Men, which starred Henry Fonda back in the 50s, considered a classic, directed by Sidney Lumet. We've written 12 Anxious Men, and it's about the most dysfunctional jury in the history of juries. Two of the jurors are conjoined. So can you imagine what craziness that comes about when one says he's guilty, one says he's innocent? By the way, the defendant in this case is a serial clown killer.
As in he kills clowns, or it's a clown that kills people?
No, he kills clowns. He's killed 5 clowns and he's been arrested. So they've come to decide what to do with this guy. And it's fun. When you're writing screenplays, they tell you to, like Rod Serling says, let your imagination go. But sometimes write something small that you can just go shoot. And this is a one-room movie. I mean, we can shoot the whole movie in one room practically. So that's on the burner. And then I've got a bunch of other things I'm working on, just trying to get some traction at a time when Hollywood has been kind of retrenching. They're not taking a lot of risks. They like to work with people they've already worked with. And even though I've produced films and I've gotten chips on the table, it's gotten hard lately. So I'm doing my best.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us tonight. As always, I'm Gary. Follow us on all social media at PodOutatNight. Once again, go check out our new sponsor, elpmerch.com. We thank them for sponsoring us, and we'll see you next time.
Sure. And by the way, if anybody wants to pick up the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, it is available on Amazon, and it's a good buy. And I'll say goodbye.
All right. We'll see you next time. Don't get lost in the void. Good night.
Thanks. Take care.